It was just last night that they'd been at dinner together. Could that be right? That last night he'd been whole, unhurt, and celebrating Passover? It was a solemn meal. Tension was in the air and arguments about what the future held and who would be to blame. But even in that awful knowing what's coming that he must have had, there were still moments where Jesus had smiled at them, and everything seemed all right for a moment. That was just who he was. He loved everybody so much, and when you were with him, you just knew. And somehow, in the space of a night and a day, he had been accused, arrested, convicted in a sham trial, and was now dying right before her eyes. It seemed impossible that this broken and bleeding man had ever smiled, his face now so twisted in pain, but she had seen it last night. It was her family's house that they'd come to, asking for a guest room to celebrate the Passover meal. She hadn't known who was coming, and it seemed like her family didn't either. Yet they'd prepared the unleavened bread, bitter herbs, salt water, sweet fruits, lamb, vegetables, and wine, and they waited. And then he came through the door. The one they were calling the Messiah. He and the others went up to the room, and she waited just outside the door in case they needed anything, in case Jesus needed anything. She listened intently, catching a few words throughout the dinner. In remembrance of me, betray me, fulfill what is written. An hour passed, the sun had set, when all of a sudden Jesus brushed past her down the stairs, heading for the door, but even in his hurry, he smiled at her. In that moment, she felt seen, and like every good thing was possible. Then Jesus was out the door, and everyone else was getting up and following him. She went upstairs to clear the table and clean everything, confused and frightened, but exhausted from the day's work. She slept restlessly all night, unable to forget his words, "In remembrance of me, remember me, remember me." In the afternoon, she had just finished her chores when a group of neighbors came by. "Come with us, hurry." She ran out the door and followed the gathering crowds, asking, "What's happening?" "It's Jesus, they have him. The chief priests are scared of him. They're going to..." It couldn't be, she thought, as they hurried along with the crowds, more people joining as they made their way toward Herod's courtyard. That man whose voice she couldn't get out of her head, "Remember me, remember me." The one she'd heard stories about, his miracles, his healings, the way he stood up to the high priests in the empire. He couldn't be the Messiah if he'd been arrested, could he? The crowd she was with arrived suddenly at a procession, a man carrying a cross up the hill, and there was Jesus. She recognized him immediately, even with his bruised face and bleeding back. He was brutally beaten, whipped, his tunic stained dark red and brown, barely able to walk, but making his way up the hill. They pressed in closer, and Jesus turned to speak to the group of women, but she couldn't hear what he said. This couldn't be happening, not to this man. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes, and she felt her throat get tight. She watched as the guards nailed Jesus to a cross and raised his body between two other men. Again he spoke, but she couldn't hear the words, so she pressed in closer, tears running down her face and sobs shaking her body. "No, stop! Please let him go!" The other women were crying with her, begging the guards for mercy. People were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he really is the Christ sent from God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him, offering him sour wine and saying, "If you really are the King of the Jews, save yourself." Above his head was a notice of the formal charge against him. It read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him, "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to him. "Don't you fear God? seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." She heard those words, the same words that Jesus had spoken at her house last night, "Remember me." Jesus had asked everyone to remember him, and this was how the people responded? By torturing him, mocking him, and murdering him like a criminal? She looked up at Jesus and was stunned to see that same smile one more time as he turned his head to the man on the cross next to him. It felt like time stopped as Jesus replied, "I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise." All the man had asked was that Jesus remember him, and yet Jesus promised to do so much more than remember, that a seemingly impossible change would come. "Today you will be with me in paradise." It was more than a promise not to forget. It was a promise of togetherness, of unity, of compassion. She saw the love in Jesus' eyes for this suffering man, wondering if anybody had ever looked at Jesus the way he'd looked at everyone else. She wanted to offer him an assurance, to tell him that she saw him too, and that she'd heard his call to remember, and that she would do more than remember him, that she would change things too. But how? Just as so many unnamed followers of Jesus were crying at his feet that day, so too today are there those in mourning for unjust executions. When the process of our so-called justice system goes from accusation to death sentence in the time it takes a bullet to fly from a police officer's gun, we cry out together. We cry out after tragic and horrific deaths like the murder of Stephon Clark, the unarmed 22-year-old black man in Sacramento who was shot by police 2 weeks ago. When the name of a beloved child of God like Stephon is raised up in grief, the powers and principalities will try to silence our outrage and pacify us by saying, "Yes, we mourn. We will use the hashtag. We will remember him. He's in our thoughts and prayers, but that is all." There are too many names that we have promised to remember, too many victims of violence in all its forms. And it is Jesus on the cross who teaches us a radically different response, going way beyond remembrance, and promising not just an absence of pain, but promising paradise. Jesus' words that day were not, "I will remember you." He didn't just say, hashtag sinner on the cross number 2, rest in peace. His assurance of paradise was wild and sounded impossible and flew in the face of the culture that was killing him in every way they could. It is the advocates and activists who are working to change systems of oppression today, who are Jesus-like in their courage and their vision. Even as they are being slandered and mocked, threatened and beaten down, they are promising to do more than remember. It is Jesus on the cross who intimately knows what it is to suffer, to be ridiculed, to not be taken seriously, to face impossible odds, to be told that what he works for will never happen, to feel alone, to give everything to the work and still be spit on, to hold steady as the nails are driven deeper, to be ridiculed and left to die. It is because of that Jesus on the cross that we must do more than remember. Amen.